Welcome, dear listeners, to an extraordinary expedition into the realm of the Pharaohs. A journey that will take us far beyond the well-worn paths of common assumptions. Ancient Egypt, a land of monumental pyramids, rising boldly into the azure blue sky, of golden treasures that survived for thousands of years in the desert sand, and of mysterious hieroglyphs that whisper of a civilization long gone. It is a place that has fired our imagination for centuries, drawing us in with its mysticism, its sublime art, and its profound ideas about the afterlife. But how much of what we believe we know about this fascinating land truly corresponds to the truth? How many of our images have been shaped by Hollywood epics, popular science simplifications, or simply false traditions that have stubbornly settled like desert sand in the cracks of our knowledge? In this audiobook, we want to lift the veil together from some of the best known and yet often misunderstood aspects of ancient Egyptian culture. We will immerse ourselves in a world that is far more complex, multi-layered, and often more surprising than the common clichés suggest. It is time to expose some of the most persistent myths, bring unknown truths to light, and view the ancient Egyptians in a new and more differentiated light. We will discover that the builders of the pyramids may not have been who we thought they were, that Egypt's most famous queen had far more to offer than legendary beauty alone, and that the notorious curse of the pharaohs may tell a completely different story. Join us on a search for traces that will lead us deep into the religious beliefs, social structures, and everyday life of this impressive high civilization. We will explore the secrets behind animal cults, decode the true nature of hieroglyphic writing, and reassess Egyptian belief in the afterlife, which is often misinterpreted as a longing for death. This audiobook is an invitation to leave behind the familiar postcard images and instead enter the hidden chambers of knowledge. We will question myths that have survived for generations and, in doing so, encounter facts that could turn the common image of ancient Egypt upside down. Imagine that we could turn back time, not merely to admire the imposing monuments in their original splendor. Thanks to countless reconstructions, we can already imagine that quite well. But rather to understand the mindset, the motivations, and the true faith of the people who created these wonders and lived this unique culture. What drove them? What did they truly believe in? And which of their stories were distorted or forgotten over the course of millennia? Prepare to expand your knowledge of ancient Egypt and perhaps even to throw some cherished assumptions overboard, because the truth is often more exciting and more multifaceted than the myth. Together, we will discover that the ancient Egyptians were not only builders of monumental tombs and authors of complex religious texts, but also people with a deep understanding of life, with a pronounced joy in existence, and with an astonishing ability to interpret their world in a way that still amazes us today. Open your mind to new perspectives and let us unveil the unknown myths of ancient Egypt, a journey of discovery that could forever change your image of this ancient superpower. Let us descend into the depths of history, decipher the hidden messages, and allow the ancient Egyptians themselves to speak to us beyond legends and misinterpretations. One of the most persistent and visually powerful cliché about ancient Egypt is undoubtedly the image of the construction of the pyramids. Generations of filmmakers, novelists, and even some older history books have conveyed to us the idea that these enormous monuments were built by countless tormented slaves. Before our mind's eye, we see crowds of people dragging gigantic stone blocks through the desert under the cracking whip of brutal overseers, tortured by hunger, thirst, and unbearable heat. This image of suffering and oppression has burned itself deeply into our collective consciousness. But what does modern Egyptology say about this? Does this dramatic portrayal correspond to historical reality? The answer, ladies and gentlemen, is a clear and definite no. The idea that slaves built the pyramids comes largely from the Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century BC, around 2,000 years after the Great Pyramids of Giza had been built. Herodotus reported 100,000 workers laboring in 3-month shifts. Although his accounts offer valuable insights, they are not reliable and often reflect the ideas, and perhaps also the propaganda, of his own time. Or they are based on the stories of priests who did not always tell him the complete truth. The image of slave labor also fit well into later narratives and was often adopted uncritically. Archaeological discoveries of recent decades, especially the excavations of workers' villages and cemeteries at Giza in the immediate vicinity of the pyramids, paint a completely different picture. Since the late 20th century, Egyptologists such as Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass have uncovered the remains of settlements that once housed thousands of workers. These settlements are bakeries, fish processing facilities, copper smelting workshops, and accommodations that point to a well-organized and well-supplied community. Huge quantities of animal bones were found, especially from cattle, sheep, and goats, suggesting that the workers were regularly provided with meat, a source of protein that would hardly have been affordable for slaves. The amount of cattle bones alone indicates that thousands of pounds of meat were prepared for the workers every day. Even more revealing are the cemeteries discovered near these settlements. The workers who died during the construction of the pyramids were buried there. Their graves are simple but respectfully arranged and lie near the royal pyramids, an honor that would hardly have been granted to slaves. The skeletons found in these graves show traces of hard physical labor. Arthritis, bone fractures, and signs of wear on the spine are common. But there is also evidence of medical care. Broken bones were set, which points to a certain degree of concern for the workforce. If these people had been rightless slaves, hardly anyone would have taken the trouble to treat their injuries. So who were these workers? The evidence suggests that they were a mixture of permanently employed, skilled craftsmen and a large number of farmers who were recruited for pyramid construction during the Nile flood, when their fields were under water and agricultural work was impossible. This system, known as corvée labor, was a kind of tax service that the population performed for the pharaoh. These workers were not slaves in the classical sense. They were free Egyptians who, for a certain period, participated in a national project of great religious and political importance. There is even graffiti left by the workers themselves on pyramid stones. These inscriptions often name the work gangs, such as the Friends of Khufu or the Drunkards of Menkaure. Such names point to a certain pride and group identity, not to the despair of forced laborers. The teams were divided into divisions, called files, and smaller groups, which suggests a highly developed organization of labor. The motivation of these workers was probably diverse. Religious zeal certainly played a major role. The pharaoh was considered a god king, and the construction of his pyramid was a sacred work that was meant to secure the cosmic order, Mot, and enable the king to ascend into eternity. Participation in this project could be viewed as a form of devotion and as service to the gods and the land. In addition, pyramid construction also offered economic incentives. The workers were provided with food, clothing, and shelter. For farmers who had no income from agriculture during the flood season, this was a welcome opportunity to secure their livelihood. It is also conceivable that it was an honor to be involved in such a monumental and prestigious project. Of course, the work was extremely hard and dangerous. Transporting and shaping the enormous stone blocks, some of which weighed many tons, required immense physical effort and involved a high risk of accidents. The living conditions in the workers' villages were simple, and discipline was probably strict, but it was not slave labor in the sense of chattel slavery, in which people were considered property and arbitrarily exploited. Rather, it was a well-organized state project based on a combination of skilled specialists and seasonal laborers who performed their service for the state and their god-king. The idea that slaves built the pyramids is therefore a myth that has been disproven by modern archaeological research. The reality was more complex and shows a remarkable degree of organization, logistics, and social structure in ancient Egypt. The pyramids are not only a testimony to the architectural genius of the Egyptians, but also to their ability to mobilize, supply, and motivate large workforces. Instead of seeing them as monuments to slavery, perhaps we should see the pyramids rather as symbols of national cohesion and the shared faith of a people capable of achieving the seemingly impossible. The stones themselves whisper stories of planning, hard work, and human ingenuity, not of chains and whiplashes. This revised image takes nothing away from the grandeur of the achievement, but gives it new dimensions of human effort and organization. Another myth that has fired the imagination for generations and permanently shaped the image of ancient Egypt revolves around one of its most famous rulers, Cleopatra VII. Her name has become a synonym for exotic beauty, irresistible seduction, and fatal love affairs with two of the most powerful men of Rome, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Hollywood adaptations, above all the monumental film with Elizabeth Taylor, have cemented the image of a woman whose primary weapons were her physical charms, with which she drove men out of their minds and wrote world history. But was Cleopatra really only this femme fatale whose power was based exclusively on her beauty? Or is there, behind this glamorous facade, a far more complex and capable personality? The truth is that the historical Cleopatra was far more than just a beautiful face. In fact, there is no clear contemporary evidence that she was considered exceptionally beautiful by our standards today or even by those of her own time. Most descriptions of her appearance come from Roman historians such as Plutarch or Cassius Dio, who often pursued a political agenda and portrayed Cleopatra as a threat to Rome. Plutarch, who wrote about a century after her death, noted that her beauty in itself was not so incomparable that it left people speechless, but that her manner, her presence, and her conversation possessed an irresistible charm. Her voice was like a many-stringed instrument, and she had the gift of making every conversation pleasant. Her coin portraits, which probably convey a more realistic image, show a woman with a prominent nose and a rather stern facial expression, not necessarily the soft features of a classical beauty. What Cleopatra unquestionably possessed, however, and What her Roman opponents often underestimated or deliberately downplayed was a sharp mind, an excellent education, and remarkable political skill. She came from the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Macedonian Greek ruling family that had taken control of Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great. She grew up in the multicultural metropolis of Alexandria, a center of scholarship and culture. Cleopatra was the first, and as far as we know the only, Ptolemaic ruler who made the effort to learn the Egyptian language. In addition to her native Greek, she reportedly spoke at least 7 other languages, including Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Ethiopian, and the languages of the Parthians and Medes. This linguistic talent was not only a sign of her intelligence, but also an invaluable tool in diplomacy and in the administration of her multi-ethnic realm. She could communicate directly with representatives of different peoples without relying on interpreters, which gave her a considerable advantage. Her political intelligence was evident in the way she asserted herself in the complex and often brutal power struggles of her time. She ascended the throne at a time when Egypt was threatened by internal unrest and the growing influence of Rome. She recognized that Egypt's independence depended on how skillfully she could interact with the Roman superpower. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and later with Mark Antony were not only romantic in nature, but above all political alliances. With Caesar, she had a son, Caesarion, whom she saw as Caesar's legitimate heir and the future ruler of an Egyptian Roman Empire. After Caesar's assassination, she allied herself with Mark Antony, with whom she had 3 children, and built a powerful political and military partnership in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. These connections were strategic moves by a ruler desperately trying to preserve the sovereignty of her country and secure the influence of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Cleopatra was also a capable administrator. She actively concerned herself with the economy of Egypt, which was considered the breadbasket of the Mediterranean world. She traveled through her land, inspected building projects, and issued decrees to improve administration and stabilize the living conditions of her subjects. She presented herself to the Egyptian population as the incarnation of the goddess Isis, which religiously legitimized her rule and strengthened her popularity in the country. Her ability to address and integrate both Greek and Egyptian culture was a key to her long reign. Roman propaganda, especially that of Octavian, the later Emperor Augustus, who saw Antony and Cleopatra as his main enemies, did everything it could to demonize Cleopatra. She was portrayed as a decadent, manipulative, and morally corrupt foreign woman who threatened Roman virtues. This distorted image strongly influenced later perceptions of Cleopatra and helped create the myth of the pure seductress. Octavian's victory over Antony and Cleopatra in the naval battle of Actium in 31 BC and their subsequent suicide sealed not only the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the incorporation of Egypt as a Roman province, but also the triumph of Augustan propaganda. So if we see Cleopatra only as a beautiful seductress, we do her an injustice. She was a highly intelligent, educated, multilingual, and politically skilled ruler who fought for the survival of her kingdom under extremely difficult circumstances. Her ability to bind 2 of the most powerful men of her time to herself testifies not only to personal charm, but above all to political foresight and strategic thinking. She used all the means available to her, including her femininity, to achieve her goals. but her power and influence were based on far more than physical appearance alone. Cleopatra was one of the most fascinating and capable women of antiquity, a queen who deserves to be recognized for her intellect and political strength just as much as for her legendary romances. The myth of the beautiful seductress may be a good story, but the historical reality of a brilliant strategist and cultivated ruler is far more impressive. Hardly any discovery has held the world in such suspense and at the same time produced so many horror stories as the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb in the Valley of the Kings by Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon in 1922. The almost unbelievable treasures found in the nearly untouched tomb of the young pharaoh were a sensation. But soon, eerie rumors mixed with the excitement. People spoke of a curse of the Pharaohs, which was supposed to strike all those who had disturbed the eternal rest of the king. When, in the following years, several people connected with the excavation died under partly mysterious circumstances, the curse seemed to be confirmed. But what is really behind this frightening legend? Is it supernatural revenge from the afterlife, or are there more rational explanations? The alleged curse was fueled above all by the death of Lord Carnarvon, the financier of the excavation, in April 1923, only a few months after the burial chamber was opened. Carnarvon died in Cairo of blood poisoning caused by an infected mosquito bite that had become inflamed while shaving, followed by pneumonia. The press of the time, always searching for a sensation, threw itself onto this story. Newspapers all over the world reported the mysterious death and connected it with the alleged curse. It was even reported that at the moment of his death in Cairo, the lights went out and his dog in England died, details that further nourished the legend. Other deaths of people who had either been present at the opening of the tomb, later visited the tomb, or came into contact with the finds were also attributed to the curse. These included, for example, the American railroad magnate George J. Gould, who died of fever after visiting the tomb, or Prince Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey of Egypt, who was shot by his wife after seeing the tomb. The early deaths of some archaeologists and workers were also placed in this context. But upon closer examination, the curse of the pharaohs turns out to be a mixture of coincidence, selective perception, and skillful media staging. First of all, it is important to note that most of the people who played a major role in opening the tomb and examining the finds lived long and healthy lives. Howard Carter himself, the central figure of the discovery, did not die until 1939, 17 years after the tomb was opened, at the age of 64, from lymphoma. Not exactly a typical curse scenario. Many other important expedition members also reached an advanced age. Studies have shown that the mortality rate and the average life expectancy of the people who entered the tomb did not differ significantly from those of a comparable group that had no contact with the tomb. For the deaths that actually occurred, there are often plausible scientific explanations. Egypt at the beginning of the 20th century was a country with different hygiene standards and medical possibilities than today. Infectious diseases such as typhus, malaria, and pneumonia were widespread. Lord Carnarvon's health had already been weakened before his journey to Egypt. Since a serious car accident, he had suffered from chronic lung problems. A mosquito bite and the resulting infection could certainly become life-threatening under those circumstances. In addition, harmful substances may indeed have existed in tombs sealed for thousands of years. Mold, bacteria, and other microorganisms can survive in such environments and cause health problems when released, especially in people with weakened immune systems. Some spores of molds, such as Aspergillus niger or Aspergillus flavus, which have been detected in ancient Egyptian tombs, can cause allergic reactions or lung infections. There has also been speculations about the possible presence of radioactive elements in the rock or toxic substances in paints and preservatives, although this is considered less likely as a cause of the deaths. Interestingly, the idea of an explicit curse threatening intruders with death is not as widespread in ancient Egyptian tombs as one might assume. There are indeed inscriptions warning potential tomb robbers, but these are often more general in nature and threaten the wrath of the gods in the afterlife or earthly punishments if the offenders were caught during their lifetime. A typical inscription might say that whoever does evil against the tomb will be judged by the crocodile in the water and the snake on land. These were more like protective spells and formulas meant to preserve the tomb and the deceased than specific death curses against archaeologists of the 20th century. The famous, often quoted inscription from Tutankhamun's tomb, which supposedly read, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the pharaoh," is an invention of the press. No such inscription was ever found in the tomb. The popularity of the curse myth can also be explained psychologically. The discovery of such an immeasurably rich and untouched royal tomb was an event of global significance. It touched deep human fascinations: mystery, adventure, death, and the supernatural. A curse added an additional element of horror and mysticism to an already exciting story. People love good stories, and the story of the avenging pharaoh was almost too good not to be believed. Writers such as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, and a supporter of spiritualism, also contributed to the spread of the curse idea by publicly speculating about it. In summary, it can be said that the curse of the pharaohs is more a product of modern sensationalism and misinterpretation than a genuine supernatural threat. The deaths can be explained by natural causes, the living conditions of the time, and the specific conditions inside ancient tombs. The Egyptians were masters at protecting their tombs, but their methods were aimed more at deterrence through guards, hidden entrances, complex tomb architecture, and religious protective spells than at magical death curses that would still be effective thousands of years later. The true treasure of Tutankhamun's tomb does not lie in a curse, but in the invaluable insights it grants us into the life, art, and faith of ancient Egypt. The myth of the curse may be more exciting, but the reality of scientific discovery is ultimately far more rewarding. The relationship of the ancient Egyptians to animals is another fascinating and often misunderstood chapter of their culture. Who does not know the images of cat-headed goddesses, falcon-headed gods, or the sacred crocodiles of the Nile? Greek and Roman writers of antiquity often reported on Egyptian animal veneration with a mixture of astonishment and mockery. They described how Egyptians treated animals like gods, fed them at the table, buried them elaborately, and even mourned them as if they were family members. This led to the widespread myth that the Egyptians simply worshipped animals themselves, that they considered every cat, every ibis, or every crocodile a deity. But the reality of Egyptian animal cults is far more nuanced and theologically complex. It is important to understand that the Egyptians did not simply worship the animal itself as a god. Rather, they saw in certain animals the manifestation or embodiment of divine forces and qualities. An animal could serve as the dwelling place of a god, as his earthly representative, or as a symbol of his specific aspects. The gods themselves often had human form, but they could also take on animal attributes or appear fully in animal form. These animal aspects helped visualize and understand the nature and power of the respective god. Take the cat, for example. Cats were highly valued in ancient Egypt, especially because of their ability to hunt snakes, scorpions, and rodents that threatened supplies and households. They were seen as protective and caring beings, but also as independent and graceful creatures. The goddess Bastet, originally perhaps a lion-headed war goddess from Lower Egypt, was later mainly depicted as a cat-headed woman, or as a cat. She was the goddess of joy, dance, music, fertility, and the protection of the home. The worship of Bastet did not mean that every house cat was seen as Bastet herself. Rather, cats embodied the qualities and presence of this goddess. Individual cats could be kept in temples and regarded as sacred, but the worship was directed toward the goddess who revealed herself through them. Another famous example is the Apis bull in Memphis, a living bull that had certain sacred marks: a black coat with a white triangle on the forehead, a vulture-shaped mark on the back, and other specific signs, was worshipped as the earthly manifestation of the creator god Ptah, or later of the god of the dead, Osiris. This ace bull lived in a temple, was cared for by priests, and was regarded as an oracle. After its death, it was elaborately mummified and buried in a gigantic underground necropolis, the Serapeum of Saqqara, in a massive sarcophagus. Its death caused nationwide mourning, and the search for a new Apis bull began. So here it was one selected animal that was considered sacred, not every bull in the land. The falcon-headed god Horus is another prominent example. The falcon, with its sharp gaze and majestic flight high in the sky, symbolized kingship, protection, and the sun. The pharaoh himself was considered the incarnation of Horus. Thoth, the god of wisdom, writing, and the moon, was often depicted as a man with the head of an ibis, or as a baboon. The ibis, with its curved beak reminiscent of a writing reed, and the baboon, which makes sounds at sunrise, were associated with aspects of this god. Sobek, the crocodile god, was especially worshipped in the Fayum, a region with many marshes and lakes where crocodiles were omnipresent. Crocodiles symbolized power, fertility, and protection, but they could also be dangerous, reflecting the ambivalent nature of some deities. Living crocodiles were kept and fed in the temples of Sobek. The mummification of animals was widespread in late Egypt, especially in the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. Millions of mummified cats, ibises, falcons, dogs, crocodiles, and other animals have been found in special animal necropolises. This does not mean, however, that all these animals were worshipped as gods. Many of these animal mummies were votive offerings. Pilgrims bought them from priests and offered them in temples in order to ask for the favor of the corresponding deity. A mummified cat was therefore an offering to Bastet, a mummified ibis a gift to Thoth. It was a form of communication with the divine sphere. There were actual breeding farms for these animals, which were then killed and mummified to meet the demand of pilgrims. The Egyptians had a deep connection to nature and observed the animal world closely. In the behavior and characteristics of animals, they recognized analogies to divine powers and human experiences. Animal cults were an expression of this complex worldview in which the boundaries between the human, the divine, and the animal were fluid. It was not primitive worship of creatures, but a differentiated system in which animals served as mediators, symbols, and manifestations of the divine. The gods could reveal themselves in animals, but they were not limited to these animal forms. They remained transcendent beings with many forms of appearance. The myth of pure animal worship, therefore, simplifies a very sophisticated religious tradition. The Egyptians did not simply worship a cat or a crocodile. They venerated the divine power that could manifest itself in these animals, the specific qualities that these animals symbolized, and the connection they represented to the world of the gods. It was a system of symbols and correspondences, deeply rooted in Egyptian cosmology and in their understanding of the world. Reverence for certain animals was part of a larger religious framework that regulated and interpreted the interaction between humans, gods, and the natural world. This perspective allows us a deeper understanding of the spirituality of a people who could recognize divine presence in all aspects of creation. When we think of ancient Egyptian writing, the image of hieroglyphs immediately appears before our inner eye. Artistic little figures of humans, animals, plants, and objects carefully carved into stone on temple walls and in tombs. Their mysterious and pictorial appearance long led to the assumption that hieroglyphs were a purely picture-based script in which each sign stood directly for a word or an idea. In addition, they were often associated with magic, religious mysteries, and secret priestly knowledge, which was further emphasized by their name as sacred carvings, derived from the Greek hieros for sacred and glyphene for to carve. But is this idea correct? Were hieroglyphs really only a mystical picture language for sacred purposes? The decipherment of hieroglyphs by Jean-François Champollion in 1822, with the help of the famous Rosetta Stone, revealed a far more complex and versatile reality. Yes, hieroglyphs are pictorial, and many signs are derived from real objects. But they are not a simple picture script like modern pictograms, in which an image directly carries its meaning. The ancient Egyptian writing system is a combination of different types of signs. First, there are logograms or ideograms. These are signs that actually stand for the word they represent. For example, the hieroglyph of a mouth could stand for the word mouth, or the image of a sun for sun. Second, and this is crucial, there are phonograms. These are signs that represent sound values, similar to our letters. Most hieroglyphs were used as phonograms. There were one-consonant signs that stood for a single consonant. The Egyptians usually did not write vowels. There were also two-consonant signs and three-consonant signs. For example, the sign for a mouth could not only mean mouth, but could also simply have the sound value R. The sign of an owl could stand for the sound M, and the sign of a water wave for the sound N. By combining these sound signs, words could be written that had nothing to do with the original pictorial meaning of the individual signs. Third, there are determinatives. These are signs that stood at the end of a word and were not pronounced. Their function was to indicate the category of meaning of the word and to avoid ambiguity. Since many words could be written the same way because vowels were not written. A word written with sound signs could, for example, be marked by a determinative in the form of a seated man as a term for a man or a male activity, or by a determinative in the form of a house as something connected with buildings. The sign of a scroll could mark a word as an abstract concept. Hieroglyphic writing was therefore a complex mixed system that conveyed both semantic and phonetic information. Mastering it required long training and was therefore reserved for an educated elite of scribes, priests, and officials. And what were hieroglyphs used for? Their best-known use is indeed found in monumental contexts, on temple walls, in tombs, on stelae, statues, and sarcophagi. Here they served religious, ritual, and ceremonial purposes. The glorification of the gods and the pharaoh, the securing of life in the afterlife, and the recording of historical events. In these contexts, great importance was often placed on the aesthetic execution and magical effectiveness of writing. The Egyptians believed that hieroglyphs themselves possessed a certain power, and that what was written could create or influence reality. But hieroglyphs were not the only form of writing in ancient Egypt, and their use was not limited to purely sacred or magical texts. For everyday use, for administrative purposes, letters, contracts, literary texts, and scientific treatises, the Egyptians developed cursive scripts that were faster to write. The oldest of these cursive scripts is hieratic, which emerged parallel to hieroglyphs already in the early period. Hieratic is essentially a simplified and connected form of hieroglyphs, written with ink and reed on papyrus, ostraca, potsherds, limestone flakes, or wooden tablets. Although the signs in hieratic can differ greatly from the original hieroglyphs, it is based on the same system. Over time, an even more cursive script developed from hieratic, demotic, which came into use from the 7th century BC and was used mainly for everyday documents and literary texts. Hieroglyphs, however, continued to be used for monumental and religious inscriptions, so to speak, as a prestige script. The contents of texts written in hieratic and demotic show the enormous range of Egyptian written culture. We find administrative documents such as tax lists, land surveys, and court records. There are private and official letters that give us insight into people's personal lives and relationships. The Egyptians had a rich literature that included wisdom teachings, stories, love poetry, hymns, and mythological texts. Famous works, such as the story of Sinuhe, the Book of the Dead, which was often written in hieratic on papyrus and illustrated with hieroglyphic vignettes, the instruction of Amenemope, testify to a highly developed literary tradition. There were also medical papyri, such as the Ebers Papyrus or the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which contain detailed diagnoses, treatments, and surgical instructions, as well as mathematical texts that demonstrate knowledge of arithmetic and geometry. The idea that hieroglyphs were only a picture script for mysteries is therefore a myth. They were part of a complex writing system that contained both phonetic and semantic elements and produced a wide range of texts extending far beyond purely religious or magical content. Monumental hieroglyphic inscriptions are certainly the most visible and perhaps the most impressive testimonies, but the less spectacular hieratic and demotic texts on papyrus and ostraca often give us an even more immediate insight into the many aspects of life, thought, and knowledge in ancient Egypt. The decipherment of these scripts opened up an entire civilization to us and showed that the Egyptians were not only masters of architecture, but also masters of the word. The enormous tomb complexes, the artistic sarcophagi, the elaborate mummification, and the detailed representations of the afterlife. Over time, all of this has led to the widespread assumption that the ancient Egyptians were a people obsessed with death. They are often imagined as a gloomy, melancholic culture that constantly thought about dying and life after death, and whose main aim was to prepare for the afterlife. But does this interpretation really scratch the surface of the ancient Egyptian soul? Or is something completely different hidden behind this apparent fascination with death, perhaps even the exact opposite? In fact, many Egyptologists today argue that the ancient Egyptians were not obsessed with death, but with life. More precisely, with the continuation of life beyond death. Their intense preparations for the afterlife did not arise from a morbid fixation on dying, but from a deep desire to continue forever the good life they had enjoyed on earth. Death was not the absolute end for them, but a transition, a gate to another form of existence for which one had to prepare as well as possible. One could say that their tombs were not monuments to death, but rather machines for ensuring immortality, carefully constructed vehicles for a journey into another dimension of being. The energy and resources they invested in their burial practices reflect the immense importance they attached to the continuity of existence. It was a race against forgetting, against dissolution, a passionate clinging to individuality and consciousness. The Egyptian idea of the afterlife was complex and multi-layered. They believed that the human being was composed of various components, all of which had to be preserved and reunited for complete continued life after death. First, there was the physical body, the cot, which had to be protected from decay through mummification in order to serve as an anchor for the spiritual aspects. Then there was the Ren, the name of a person. The name was an existential component of identity. As long as the name was spoken and remembered, the person continued to exist. That is why the careful recording of the name in inscriptions and the destruction of an enemy's name were so important. The shoot, the shadow, was another aspect that accompanied the human being like a double, and was also considered part of the personality that had to survive. Of central importance, however, were the Ka and the Ba. The Ka, often translated as life force, energy, or invisible double, was created together with the person at birth and accompanied him through life. At death, the Ka left the body, but it still needed food and offerings in order to exist. That is why food offerings were placed in tombs and depictions of food and drink were added. The Ka could nourish itself from the essence of these offerings. The tomb statue of the deceased often served as a dwelling place for the Ka. The Ba, on the other hand, is usually interpreted as the personality, the soul, or the character of a human being, everything that made an individual unique. It was often depicted as a bird with a human head, which had the ability to move freely between the world of the living and the tomb of the deceased. After death, the Ba could leave the body and ascend to the sky, but it had to return regularly to the mummified body in order to unite with it and with the Ka. This union was crucial for continued existence in the afterlife. Finally, there was the Kit, the transfigured effective spirit of the deceased, who, after successfully overcoming the dangers of the afterlife and receiving a positive judgment in the judgment of the dead, was admitted into the community of the gods and the other blessed dead. The Ak was the goal, the highest stage of post-mortem existence, a state of enlightenment and power. The transformation into an Akh was a complex process achieved through rituals, knowledge of sacred texts, and a morally conducted life. The famous opening of the mouth ceremony, for example, a complex ritual performed on the mummy, or on a statue of the deceased served to restore the dead person's senses, the ability to speak, see, hear, eat, and drink, and thus to revive him for life in the afterlife and enable his transformation into an Akh. Mummification. This process, often perceived as macabre, was therefore not only a method of preserving the body, but a deeply religious act aimed at preserving the physical shell for the spiritual components and making rebirth possible. The removal of the internal organs, their preservation in canopic jars, the drying of the body with natron, and the careful wrapping in linen bandages, often accompanied by the addition of amulets and the recitation of protective spells. All of this was part of a highly developed theological concept. The grave goods, often misunderstood as an expression of wealth and status, had the primary function of enabling the deceased to live in the afterlife in a way that corresponded to life on earth, or even surpassed it. Food, drinks, furniture, tools, jewelry, clothing, and the already mentioned shabtis, small servant figurines that were supposed to perform work for the deceased in the afterlife, were essential for a comfortable and carefree existence after death. It was not about accumulating riches, but about ensuring the continuity of living standards and lifestyle. The Egyptians did not imagine the afterlife itself as a gloomy place. An important concept was the field of reeds, or field of Iaru, an idealized version of Egypt, a fertile land with abundant harvests, rivers, and gardens, where the deceased could live in peace and abundance, similar to life on earth, only without suffering, illness, or hardship. It was a place of eternal youth and joy, where one dwelled with the gods and took part in their festivals. But the path there was by no means easy. To reach the field of reeds, the deceased had to undertake a dangerous journey through the Duat, the underworld. It was populated by terrifying demons, guardians with knives, and fiery lakes. The various afterlife books, such as the Amduat, the Book of What is in the Underworld, or the Book of Gates, describe this nightly journey of the sun god Ra through the 12 hours of the night, and the associated trials that the deceased also had to face by identifying with the sun god. Only with the right knowledge, the proper spells, and a pure heart could one overcome these obstacles. At the end of this journey stood the judgment of Osiris. The famous scene of the weighing of the heart, often depicted in the Book of the Dead, shows how the heart of the deceased, considered the seat of conscience and memory, is weighed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order. The god Thoth recorded the result. If the heart was light like the feather, meaning free of serious sins and in harmony with Ma'at, the deceased was declared justified or true of voice and was allowed to enter the field of reeds. But if it was heavier because it was burdened by evil deeds, it was devoured by the devourer of the dead, Ammit, a terrifying hybrid creature made of crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus. This meant the final annihilation of existence, the second death, the Egyptians' greatest fear. The numerous religious texts, such as the pyramid texts from the Old Kingdom, the coffin texts from the Middle Kingdom, and the so-called Book of the Dead, actually the Book of Coming Forth by Day, from the New Kingdom and the Late Period, were collections of spells, hymns, and magical formulas intended to help the deceased overcome the dangers of the underworld, appease the gods, calm the guardians of the gates, and successfully pass the judgment of the dead. They were, therefore, by no means an expression of an obsession with death, but rather practical instructions, a divine navigation system, and spiritual armor for successful continued life and the attainment of the AKH state. These texts are filled with a deep knowledge of the human psyche, of fears of the unknown, and of an unshakable beliefs in the possibility of transformation and redemption. When one looks more closely at the depictions in tombs, especially in the tombs of nobles and officials of the New Kingdom, one finds not only religious scenes but also an abundance of vivid images of daily life that reflect the joy of existence. One sees the tomb owner hunting birds in the papyrus marshes, fishing with a spear or net, overseeing the harvest in his fields, and supervising grape harvesting and beer production. Scenes of opulent banquets are especially popular, in which the deceased celebrates with family and friends, musicians play, dancers perform, and servants offer food and drinks. These scenes were not only meant to recall the happy life that had passed, but also to magically guarantee its continuation in the afterlife. They were a kind of eternal snapshot of ideal moments that were to be preserved forever. They show a culture that loved and enjoyed life in all its facets. The beauty of nature, the warmth of family, the satisfaction of work and success, and the joys of social gatherings. The inscriptions in the tombs often express the wish to continue seeing the sun, breathing the fresh breeze of the north wind, drinking the cool waters of the Nile, and enjoying the pleasures of love and life. May you go out and enter into your tomb. May you not be turned away at the gates of the Duat. May your Ka be with you, and your Bi not be separated from your corpse, are typical wishes that emphasize the continuation of the vital aspects. Egyptian art and literature outside the tomb context also testifies to a great joy in life and a deep appreciation for the earthly world. Love poems, often marked by great tenderness and passion, praise the beauty of the beloved and the pleasures of physical love. Hymns to the gods celebrate not only their power, but also the beauty of creation, the fertility of nature, and the gifts of life. Wisdom teachings offer advice for a successful, ethical, and fulfilled life on earth, emphasizing the importance of family, social responsibility, and justice. The Egyptians loved festivals, of which there were many throughout the year, celebrated with processions, music, dancing, food, and drink. The beautiful festival of the valley, for example, during which the statues of the gods from the temples in Karnak and Luxor visited the necropolis of Thebes West, was an opportunity for the living to come into contact with their deceased relatives, bring offerings to the tombs, and celebrate together so that the boundary between this world and the next was lifted for a moment. Their houses, even if built of perishable materials, were often decorated with colorful paintings showing natural scenes, geometric patterns, or images of festivities. They placed great value on body care, cosmetics, and beautiful clothing, as shown by the many finds of toilet articles, cosmetic palettes, mirrors, and jewelry. The emphasis on death and the afterlife in archaeological finds is also due to the fact that tombs and temples, the houses for eternity and the houses of the gods, were built of durable stone and therefore survived for thousands of years better than the houses and palaces of the living, which were mostly built of perishable mud brick. The desert, where most necropolises were established, also provided ideal conditions for the preservation of organic materials. This can lead to a distorted perception in which aspects connected with death and eternity are overrepresented, while evidence of everyday life is scarcer. Yet even these everyday testimonies, tools, household objects, toys, and letters on ostraca tell of a busy, pulsating life. In summary, The myth of an Egyptian culture obsessed with death requires critical reassessment. Their elaborate burial rituals and ideas of the afterlife were not an expression of fear of life or song for death, but rather an expression of their unrestrained will to live and their deep belief in the possibility of continuing the good life beyond the threshold of death. It was a culture that valued life so highly that it did everything it could to hold on to it forever, to preserve it, and to project it into eternity in an idealized form. The tombs were not places of mourning or horror, but rather magically charged machines for ensuring eternity, filled with everything that made life worth living. The ancient Egyptians were not worshippers of death, but unshakable optimists who believed in the eternal return of life, just as the sun rises anew in the east every morning and the Nile blesses the land anew each year with its life-giving flood and fertility. Their culture was a triumphant song to the indestructibility of life. We have now completed a long and hopefully enlightening journey through the world of ancient Egyptian myths and misunderstandings. We have seen that the builders of the pyramids were not tormented slaves, but organized and motivated workers. We have come to know Cleopatra as far more than just a seductive beauty, as an intelligent and politically skilled ruler. The notorious curse of the Pharaohs turned out to be a product of modern sensationalism, and the animal cults revealed themselves as expressions of a complex theology, not as primitive worship of creatures. We have illuminated the true nature of hieroglyphs as a versatile writing system, beyond pure magic and mystery, and finally reinterpreted the alleged obsession with death among the Egyptians as a deep desire for eternal life. These revelations show us one thing above all. The civilization of ancient Egypt was immeasurably rich, profound, and often surprisingly different from what popular cliches would have us believe. Behind the golden masks, the monumental stones, and the mysterious symbols lies a culture of astonishing complexity and human depth. The Egyptians were pioneers in science and technology, masters of art and architecture, creators of a rich literature, and profound thinkers in matters of religion, life, and the cosmos. By questioning these old myths and striving to gain a more accurate picture, we not only pay respect to historical truth, but also discover the fascinating ability of the human mind to interpret the world, find order in chaos, and strive for meaning and eternity. The ancient Egyptians left us a legacy that goes far beyond material remains. It is a legacy of ideas, beliefs, and cultural forms of expression that can still inspire us and make us think today. The fascination with ancient Egypt will probably never fade. The pull of its mysteries is too strong, its achievements too impressive, and the human questions it raises too universal. But it is important that we approach this fascination with a critical and open mind, ready to examine cherished assumptions and allow new insights. Egyptology is a living science, and new discoveries are constantly being made that refine and expand our understanding.